Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamane. You are watching part of a 7-part series of a public webinar that I gave this past spring on 10 essential observations on guns in America. I hope that you find some value in this work. Everything that I do, I try to provide free with no paywall so that it's free to you. But honestly, this work is not free to me. So if you would like to help support my work, minimally, if you could like and share this work in your own social network so that more people have an opportunity to learn about what I'm doing and the education that I'm trying to give can spread beyond my own built-in social networks. If you would like to financially support the work I do and all of the infrastructure and time that it takes, in the show notes you'll see some options for doing that, notably making contributions through my Buy Me a Coffee platform, which is an alternative to Patreon that you may be more familiar with. So I do appreciate your support. I do hope you find some value in this work, and I do hope that you'll support me in one of these ways that makes sense to you. So let's get into gun culture 2.0, changing face and future of gun culture, and some Q&A. All right, so James writes observations 3 and 4. Let's first revisit, recall the first two observations that we covered, that half of the households in the country own at least one gun, and there are 200 million guns already in circulation in the United States, give or take a few tens of millions. We addressed that last week. His third observation is concerning those guns, right? That most of those 200 million guns are owned for socially innocuous sport and recreational purposes. And observation 4, and here's only part of observation 4 because we'll carry observation 4 over into the next couple of sessions. But the first part of observation 4 being many guns are also owned for self-defense against crime, right? And the evolution in gun culture from that third observation he makes about most guns being owned for innocuous sport and recreational purposes to the fact that most guns today are owned for self-defense against crime really gets at the heart of the evolution of American gun culture that I've spoken about under the rubric of gun culture 2.0. Now, I stole the concept of gun culture 2.0 from Michael Bain. When I first started studying guns back in 2012, 2011, 2012, I thought that I was just going to look at the concealed carry phenomenon as a kind of discrete thing that was happening. And as I learned more about concealed carry and as I got more involved in guns personally, I realized that concealed carry was just part of a broader shift that was happening in gun culture. And I was fortunate early on to listen to one of Michael Bain's podcasts in which he talked about the concept of gun culture 2.0. So I basically stole that idea from him. I started using it. I called my blog Gun Culture 2.0, and you can see on May 22nd of 2012, my sister's birthday, by the way, I posted my very first blog post about how I was getting into Gun Culture 2.0. So I was really concerned when later on, as I stayed involved in the study of gun culture, and I went to the NRA annual meeting for the first time, and I met Michael Bain, I sort of sheepishly let him know that I was the one who was stealing his concept of gun culture 2.0, and he couldn't have been more gracious, and he's always been a big supporter of mine and the work I do, and he's never, felt any propriety about the idea of gun culture 2.0. But I do always want to, give credit to Michael Bain for, conceptualizing this change that was happening within gun culture that I sort of latched onto, and then sort of brought into the academic study of guns in one of my very first publications on the sociology of U.S. gun culture, I introduced the distinction between gun culture 1.0 and gun culture 2.0. And this quote here is just a short passage from this article where I say that hunting, target shooting, and collecting continue to be important aspects of U.S. gun culture today. But at the same time, the center of gravity of U.S. gun culture has shifted over the past half century from recreational shooting to armed self-defense, from gun culture 1.0, America's historic gun culture, to gun culture 2.0. So that is this evolution in a nutshell. And empirically, I think probably the easiest way to see this is in surveys asking gun owners, why do you own guns? And you can see even over a relatively short period of time from August 1999, when 26% of respondents in this Pew Research Center work said that they owned a gun for protection, to February 2013, 48%, and declines in the other reasons as the primary reason: hunting, target shooting, that it's a constitutional right, gun collecting, and so on. And every survey that's been done more recently than 2013 has shown an increase from that 48%. So this National Lawful Use of Guns survey from 2019 showed about 60%, or nearly 60%, of gun owners said that defense was their primary reason for owning a gun. So if you think about James Wright publishing this article in 1995, he's in the early stages of the development of gun culture 2.0. But he's still understanding, as this first table shows, like the predominant reasons that people said they owned guns were hunting, target shooting, and collecting, those gun culture 1.0 activities. Now, important caveat about gun culture 1.0, and I do say it in that article that I mentioned, that these gun culture 1.0 activities are still part of gun culture. And a very simplistic reading of the gun culture 2.0 idea is that now gun culture is just defensive and these other things have fallen by the wayside. But in reality, it is about understanding what the center of gravity of gun culture is. Where's the core of gun culture, even though gun culture itself remains very diverse. But I'm reminded of the literary critic Kenneth Burke's idea that every way of seeing is also a way of not seeing, right? So the insight of gun culture 1.0 has as a liability that it may make it seem like these other aspects of gun culture are not relevant. And in reality, as we'll see in some of the data that I'll show in a bit, people own guns for multiple reasons, right? People don't just own guns for one reason. So, evolution and contours of gun culture 2.0. I did post an article that I published the last, must have been in 2022 now, which really covers a lot of this ground in sort of the most systematic way that I've done since that original Sociology of U.S. Gun Culture publication. It's pretty dense, so I'll, sort of review it for you here. And if I say anything that's of interest here, you might want to explore that article further. But the way I conceptualize the evolution of American gun culture is from a sort of gun culture 0.0, or we might say this is the baseline of American gun culture from about 1607, when people land in Jamestown, Virginia. They have guns with them all the way through about the middle of the 19th century. This is the kind of era in which practical considerations reign supreme. Then from the middle of the 19th century into the 21st century, gun culture 1.0, that recreational culture of guns, really becomes the center of gun culture. And then from about 2010 to the present, defensive gun culture sort of reigns supreme. Obviously, the the growth of gun culture 2.0 begins before 2010, but I would say that the transition from gun culture 1.0 to gun culture 2.0 is clearly complete by 2010. But these are very rough datings, just sort of, this is a heuristic device. If you find it helpful, that's awesome. If you find it overruns some of the complexity of the reality, I fully admit that. But in the practical era, which in the U.S. Context from the colonies forward, 1607 to 1850, guns are really tools of survival, in terms of procuring food and defending life. Also tools of offense, so oppressing other human beings and expanding across the continent. And also tools of resistance, most notably resistance to the British Crown in the American Revolution. But that heading notes, from 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, guns were also tools of survival and offense. And here I really draw on the work of Randy Mian. This was in the supplemental resources from last week, the Liberal Gun Owners Lens. I posted a link to the document itself, also a couple of videos that Randy put together that were based on presentations that he usually makes in my Sociology of Guns class. But I want to read this passage. This is taken from my Gun Culture 2.0 article that I mentioned that's linked in the syllabus. But so I write, when I say guns are normal and normal people use guns, as I said last week, I'm not merely describing the contemporary American scene. The normality runs far deeper. Projectile weapons are behaviorally normal for Homo sapiens as a species. Today's widely owned civilian firearms are part of an unbroken thread of what Randy Mian calls the human-weapon relationship, stretching back to rocks in the uniquely evolved hands of our prehistoric ancestors. The anthropologic continuity of projectile weapons runs from rocks to spears, to atlatls, to bows, to firearms. Human history profoundly overlaps with the history of developing more and more lethal projectiles, which could be hurled further and further. Our ancestors' ability to deliver death from a distance, the capacity to kill or injure remotely from many body diameters away, was central to the evolutionary success of our species via hunting and conflict with other hominins. Only modern humans possessed advancing projectile weapons, which likely played a crucial role in our success over competing Homo species like Neanderthals. Now, that's a mouthful, but again, I think it highlights the importance of understanding not just the cultural normality of guns in the United States today, but the deep roots of anthropological normality. Now, just looking in this early American period at the normality of gun ownership, you all may be familiar with a book written by an Emory University historian, Michael Belisle, called Arming America: The Origins of a National Gun Culture. This won, as you can see in this graphic, the Bancroft Prize, which is the highest prize for works of American history. And it was widely praised for Belisle's argument that gun culture was really a 19th century invention, that guns weren't really a part of early American history. This went against a lot of people's understandings of early American history. And so there were some other scholars like James Lindgren from Northwestern University, also Clayton Kramer, who tried to verify the data that Belisle was using in making this claim that guns were not common in early America. And they basically found that he fabricated his data. He made reference to archives of data that didn't actually exist. He was investigated and he was either fired or resigned. I don't know. It's not a consequential difference. But he lost his tenured professorship at Emory University and also had the Bancroft Prize rescinded. So, in contrast to Bilal's claims in my work, I quote from Kramer and Lindgren that gun ownership appears to have been the norm for freemen and not terribly unusual for free women and at least male children through the colonial, revolutionary, and early republic periods, according to Clayton Kramer. And one reliable estimate of gun ownership in early America found guns in 50 to 73% of male estates and 6 to 38% of female estates. These rates compare favorably to other common items listed in male estates like swords or edged weapons, 14%, Bibles, 25%, or cash, 30%. So again, from the earliest period, the gun culture 0.0, this practical ownership of guns as tools of survival, offense, and resistance, eventually gives way in the 19th century to more recreational purposes coming to the fore. Now, again, we don't want to be overly simplistic because even in that early period, people used their firearms recreationally, right? If, people were sitting around and they had time to pass and they had a rifle or two, they would engage in shooting competitions, right? Who can hit that rock over there, or who can get closest to that tree stump over there? I mean, this is just something that human beings do when they have time to pass. But hunting as a sort of more formal activity, hunting as a recreational activity, as opposed to, simply for survival, really starts to emerge in the 19th century, mid-19th century. More formalized target and competition shooting, including in connection with hunting, like squirrel hunts, or as you see the emergence of clay pigeon target shooting, those sorts of things. Those become more formalized. You get the establishment of gun clubs. And then, later in the 19th century and certainly into the 20th century, you see people starting to collect firearms on a broader scale. People always used to collect firearms, especially people of means. But here, I think we're talking more about more common people involved in collecting. So defensive gun culture, sort of the seeds are really planted of this in the social unrest and the social uncertainty of the 1960s, which creates a certain interesting parallel to the social unrest and the social uncertainty of the year 2020 and beyond. But those seeds begin to bud in the 1970s and 80s, where we see the emergence of, for example, a civilian defensive gun industry and also the concealed carry movement. And those things really flower then from the 1990s and forward. And really, as I will show, by 2010, defensive gun culture is really the core of American gun culture. So here's some evidence that I will give for the rise of gun culture. Look at public opinion data. We can look at handgun prevalence. We can look at advertising, and we can look at the entire concealed carry revolution, which we'll do as a separate topic next week in Module 3. So I'll just cover those first 3 data points here. So first of all, public opinion data highlighting gun culture 2.0. This is from the Pew Research Center, a very big survey they did in 2017. I mentioned it last week when I talked about that question about what percentage of Americans had ever shot a gun. So I really like this survey, even though it's getting a little bit older now. I find myself going back to it quite a lot. But they asked the question as to what is a major reason or the major reason that you own a gun. So this is where you can name more than one reason. So you can see that 67, 38, 30, and 13, and 8, that adds up to more than 100. So you could say more than one reason, but even being able to give more than one reason, still 2/3 of gun owners say that protection is the major reason why they own a gun, as compared to 38 and 30% and 13% for hunting, sport shooting, and gun collecting. So that's the key distinction, I would say, between gun culture 2.0 and gun culture 1.0 in this data. They did update this survey last year, 2023, and you can see the percentage of people who say that gun protection is a major reason has grown from 67 to 72%. So even though it was very high, it continues to get higher. If you add in minor reason, you're adding another 9%. So really only 9% of gun owners today say that protection is not a reason at all for them owning a gun. Hunting, the hunting, and here's, I feel, terrible focusing so much on defensive gun ownership because hunting is a really important and understudied topic. Sport shooting is a very important and understudied topic. Gun collecting is important and understudied. I'm just one person, and unfortunately, most scholars working in the social sciences don't have an interest in these legitimate uses of firearms. But it would be interesting to know something about those 52% of gun owners for whom hunting is a major or minor reason for owning guns, right? Or those 59% of people for whom sport shooting is a major or minor reason. But again, if we're just looking at this sort of transition from gun culture 1.0 to gun culture 2.0, I've not seen any data that suggests that this is not happening. Rather, every piece of data that I look at shows this evolution toward self-defense as being the core of American gun culture. Handgun prevalence, I think, is another sort of indicator of this evolution. And, I think the reason why, even though, there is handgun hunting, people can collect historic handguns, you can sport shoot and plink and recreational shoot with handguns, but handguns really are the sort of personal defense weapon par excellence, right? Now, this is, civilian use here. I'm not talking about, using your handgun to fight your way back to your rifle or whatever primary and secondary things that you talk about in your tactical gun classes. This is the realistic idea that for many people, if they want to acquire a single firearm for self-defense, that they're going to look at a handgun. If they want to have a firearm in public for self-defense, they're going to be looking at a handgun. So handgun prevalence is significant, but again, adding complexity to the story, every museum that I've ever gone into shows examples of historical handguns, including concealable handguns or pocket pistols, like this pistol I saw in the Colonial Williamsburg from 1700. This is an example I saw in the Smith & Wesson Museum that's from the late 19th century. The good old bike gun, people don't talk as much about the bike gun anymore, but, this is something that was advertised in the 19th century. I don't know that you could get away with that kind of advertisement today. Certainly the Colt 1908 hammerless sold hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of units in the early 1900s. And this, again, is advertised as a fine weapon to take with you to defend yourself against the growing menace of auto bandits and thieves, right? So, the scriptural admonition that there's nothing new under the sun, this remains true in terms of handguns, but still, it's not new, but it is new, right? So handgun ownership in the 1950s was estimated at fewer than 1 out of 7 gun owning households having a handgun. And that grows by the 1970s to 1 in 4. The 1960s were a huge period in which handgun ownership increased. By the 1990s, it's estimated that 1 in 2 gun owning households has a handgun in it. By 2015, we're looking at 2/3. And according to an estimate that was given to me earlier today by Deb Azrael, who's one of the leading gun researchers at Harvard University, she said that she estimates about 8 in 10 gun-owning households today have a handgun in them, right? So again, handguns are not new, but we can't deny the fact that handguns have become more prevalent as ownership of firearms for defensive purposes has become more prevalent. This is a little table from the trace. The data is older, but I think it's, very suggestive of something that we'll talk more about next week is, the coincidence of the rise in the percentage of US adults who have concealed carry permits, which is the yellow dotted line in this graphic, alongside the production of 380 caliber pistols. So this really skyrockets, as you can see, in 2007, along with concealed carry permits. Of course, nowadays people just carry, 9mm pistols that are basically the same size as these 380 caliber pistols, but you get the basic idea. Okay, advertising is the sort of last indicator of uh, the evolution towards gun culture 2.0 that I'll want to talk about today. This is something that I've spent a good bit of time collecting data on and analyzing. Advertising is nice as a metric because we can look at advertising over very long periods of time, right? The public opinion data, on the kinds of questions that we really want to know about doesn't go back that far, right? So we can see defensive gun ownership questions only asked periodically back in time, but advertising is a common unit of measure that we can look at. And I, in fact, looked at the way that guns were advertised in the American Rifleman over a 100-year period from 1918 to 2017. And you can see in this graphic, there's considerable variation. If you look at the orange and the blue squiggly lines, that's the actual underlying data. But in order to get a sense of the trend, we sort of fit an average line that kind of reduces the variance from the line to the actual data. And green represents personal protection, self-defense, concealed carry as themes in advertising. And red represents hunting and sport or recreational shooting. So green is your gun culture 2.0 line. Red is your gun culture 1.0 line. And you can see they are mirror images of one another, crossing over, in this case, around 2014. I said about 2010, the change from gun culture 1.0 to gun culture 2.0 is complete. This is part of the reason why I argue that. Now, the American Rifleman is just one magazine, so we did a replication study using Guns magazine. The time period isn't as long because Guns didn't start publishing until 1955, but we looked at that through 2019, and we basically see the similar pattern, right? The steady rise in gun culture 2.0 themes in advertising, slight rise in gun culture 1.0 in the 1960s when hunting and outdoor activities sort of became really popular in American society as a whole, but then a pretty clear decline in that theme through the latter half of this period, and crossing over again around 2011. This evolution is complete, which is, again, not to say that there is no gun culture 1.0 anymore, but clearly the center of gun culture today is on self-defense. So, one of the implications of this change has to do with the possibility of a changing face of American gun owners. So, I have argued for quite some time now that gun culture 2.0 has at least the potential, more potential than gun culture 1.0 to be inclusive, because self-defense is a universal concern, right? Whether you hunt or not, whether you recreationally shoot or not, whether you collect or not, those are more particular concerns and interests, but everybody has some level of concern about self-defense and safety. And some people will address that concern with firearms, right? So the limits on who is going to address their self-defense concern with firearms is much less limited than the number of people who will become interested in gun culture 1.0 activities. So again, to go back to last week's, those the average gun owner being politically conservative, middle-aged married man from the rural South or Mountain West. Again, the Duck Dynasty stereotype of the statistically average gun owner. By way of review, there's a problem with looking at these statistical averages. They're helpful as far as they go, but they sometimes don't go far enough because the underlying distribution that produces that statistical average gets sort of glossed over when we just look at that statistical average. Again, if you're more easier for you to think about this in terms of reproductive organs, right? The average American has one testicle and one ovary. Very much getting away from the question of how are those testicles and ovaries distributed. So in terms of, how do we slice this pie to get some insight into the changing face of defensive gun owners? One way I like to do this is to look at people who are gun owners, but who only own handguns, right? So I think if, this is not a perfect measure of defensive gun ownership, but, it does suggest who is it that may be owning firearms largely for defensive purposes. And if we look at the percentage of gun owners in different categories who own only handguns, we see some pretty significant demographic differences, right? So, among male gun owners, only 22% only own handguns, but among female gun owners, 42% only own handguns. Okay. In terms of racial groups, among whites, 20% only own handguns, but among blacks, 3 times that proportion. 57% of African-American gun owners only own handguns, and 40%, or almost twice the rate, of Hispanics, excuse me, non-white Hispanics only own handguns. Right? 15% of people who live in rural areas only own handguns, but if you're suburban or urban, it's 2 to 3 times that rate. And last, if you're a conservative, 20% of conservative gun owners only own handguns, but almost twice that, 36% of liberals who own guns only own handguns. So this is a demographic picture of defensive gun owners that looks somewhat different than that Duck Dynasty stereotype. And again, I use that somewhat humorously, right? That, in terms of the statistically average gun owner, my point is really that the average conceals more than it reveals, right? And for a lot of people, especially those who are outside of gun culture, if you say gun owner, that's what they're going to picture. And I think that picture may have been accurate at some point in history. It's becoming less and less accurate all the time. Okay, another really interesting way to look at sort of the changing face of gun owners is to look at new gun owners. And this study, I think it's in the syllabus. I hope it is. If it's not, I'll put it in there. Differences between new and long-standing U.S. gun owners, results from a national survey. So again, a lot of basic studies of firearms owners is, do you own a gun or not? But fortunately, these scholars ask the question, among people who own guns, how long have they been a gun owner, right? And they classified new gun owners as people who own guns for 5 years or less. And it's interesting, we've thought a lot about new gun owners since 2020. But there are constantly new gun owners coming into the fold, and there's constantly people who are leaving gun ownership ranks. And something like 10% of all gun owners are new gun owners by this definition of owning guns for fewer than 5 years. And again, so if we look at new gun owners compared to long-standing gun owners, we start to see some of these significant demographic differences, right? So new gun owners are more likely to be female, to have young kids, to identify as politically liberal, to own only handguns, and to own guns for protection. right? So this is the face of new gun owners in an important way, right? They're less likely to be older, to be white, to have grown up with a gun in the home. I think this is, a really significant aspect of gun culture 2.0, right? It's a lot of these new gun owners are like myself, who came from totally outside of gun ownership. So it's not like they're returning to the gun ownership of their youth. They grew up in homes without guns, right? And they're also less likely to own guns for hunting or collecting, right? So they're less likely to participate in those gun culture 1.0 activities. And so again, new gun owners much more fit the mold of gun culture 2.0 in terms of only owning handguns and owning guns for protection, right? And they represent a changing face of gun owners relative to longstanding gun owners. Now, we can't not talk about the great gun buying spree of 2020 plus. Everybody who is involved in guns, whether manufacturing, training, gun stores, just observers, people who talk to their friends, realize that something crazy was going on in 2020 and beyond 2020. This graphic may be hard for many of you to see. But we saw sort of growing number of adults purchasing firearms through 2020, right, and into 2021 with the insurrection and Biden's inauguration. So this is along the lighter bluish color along the top, and then the gray in the bottom shows the pattern for new gun owners, and the bars are the sort of margin of error. But so, you can see that new gun owners largely track all gun owners in terms of when they're buying, except for January and February of 2021. But then they get back into that pattern more in March of 2021. So again, a lot of people were buying guns. There was a strong suspicion that there was a lot of new gun owners, and this research on firearms purchasing during the pandemic bore that out. So a survey, 2021 National Firearms Survey by scholars at Harvard and Northeastern, found that 6.5% of all US adults purchased a gun in 2020, right? So this is not just gun owners who purchased a gun. This is every single US adult who had an opportunity to buy a gun. 6.5% did. That's almost 17 million people. And 1.5% of every US adult became a new gun owner in 2020. So almost 4 million people became new gun owners during the pandemic. Now, what are the characteristics of those new pandemic gun owners? So again, this is from firearms purchasing during the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2021 National Firearms Survey, right? So 4 in 10 of those new pandemic gun buyers were 30 to 44 years old, right? So on the younger side, half of them were female. And last week, people asked me to talk about women gun owners, and I do have some slides on women gun owners. So we'll talk about that specifically. 20% of new pandemic gun owners were Black, 20% Hispanic, so 40% Black or Hispanic. 1 in 3 were from urban areas, and half were from suburban areas, right? So again, lots of media attention, Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press being fascinated by the fact that women were increasingly getting into gun ownership, minority women, urban people, suburban people, and so on. So again, changing face of gun owners through the pandemic, a huge number of new gun owners, many of them coming from new and non-traditional gun owner backgrounds. Now, women gun owners. So this isn't just specific to pandemic gun buying, although much of this probably applies to those women who bought guns during the pandemic year. But this is, it's incredible given the long-standing history of women being gun owners in the United States and the rising number of women who are gun owners, that scholars have really paid very little attention to this. So this is one study that actually does pay specific attention to women gun owners. You can see that this is from a special issue of this journal on sociological perspective on guns in America. I'm happy and very proud to say that I was one of the two special editors of that issue, and I really, tried to reach out to people to ask them to submit their work on new and non-traditional gun owners. So have this piece that we published. We also published a piece on LGBT gun owners, and these are some of the very, very few studies that look at these groups of gun owners. So much of sociology is dominated by hegemonic masculinity as the dominant approach to understanding guns and gun owners. And it just leaves a lot of the reality of guns and gun ownership out of the equation. So Margaret Kelly, professor of American Studies at the University of Kansas. She collaborated with Chris Ellison, who I mentioned earlier, on this Guns in American Life survey, acronym GALS, and you can probably get where they're coming from now. Very strong emphasis on women gun owners in this survey, asking a lot of unique questions. So she published this article, Feminism in Firearms, Gun Ownership, Gun Carrying, and Women's Empowerment. So, definitionally, she is going to use feminist identity as one of her explanatory variables. This is how she measured it. How well does the term feminist, whatever that means to you, describe you? 5 response categories ranging from not at all to extremely well. So fairly typical, categorization, but, interesting that rather than sort of defining ahead of time what it means to be a feminist, she allowed people to, use their own definition of feminist, which I think, is fair. And then her gun carrying question was, how often, if ever, do you carry a handgun or pistol outside your home, not including times when you're just transporting it? They had more response categories, but they broke it down to, whether you carried never or some of the time versus carrying most or all of the time. So feminist identity is one of their independent variables. Gun carrying is one of their dependent variables. Right. And here are some of their findings. This is on the ownership question. So gun owning women tend to be younger, whiter, higher income, and more politically conservative than women who do not own guns. I hope that makes sense, right? So if you compare the women in her sample who own guns to those who don't, the gun-owning women, younger, whiter, higher income, more politically conservative, and also more likely to report having been the victim of an attack or an assault other than a sexual assault. And I'm not certain why they made that exclusion. Right? So this is how gun owners differ, gun-owning women differ from non-gun-owning women, right? And they find that feminist identity is negatively correlated with gun ownership. Right. So among all women, those who are gun owners report having a feminist identity at lower levels than those who don't own guns. Okay. Now, this is just part of the story that they find, though. It's much more sort of complicated than that. So among women who own handguns, those who carry are younger, more politically conservative, and more likely to have been a victim of an attack or an assault. Again, so just comparing among women who own handguns, do you carry the guns almost all the time or all the time versus never or some of the time? The carriers are younger, more politically conservative, and more likely to have been victimized. Race and income, unlike in the gun ownership variable, doesn't affect the likelihood of gun carry. So I think that's an interesting finding in that. And then here, Kelly finds that feminist identity is positively correlated with gun carrying, right? So again, in connection with that earlier issue of gun ownership, feminist identity is negatively associated with owning a gun overall, but then among women who own handguns, if you have a higher feminist identity, you're more likely to carry your gun some or all of the time. So again, very nuanced study, and it's, as I like to say, things are often sort of both and rather than either or. There's a lot of complexity uh, around who owns and who carries guns, and we really need to dig into that and lean into that a lot more. Now, the final caveat to this aspect of her study is that she found that the effect of feminist identity on gun carrying is mediated by how often respondents go to the range and how frequently they participate in ladies' nights or other women-only shooting events, right? So people with a higher feminist identity engage in range days, range training, visiting the range, and also participating in women's gun events more than people who have lower levels of feminist identity. So when you include all of these variables in a statistical model, you find that it's not so much feminist identity in itself that's correlated with gun carrying, but the things that people who have a feminist identity do that make them more likely to carry their guns on a regular basis. So this is a real, if you're interested in encouraging women to carry firearms on a regular basis, getting them involved in shooting their guns and participating in events, really does have a profound effect on what people actually do. All right. So just briefly on what the future holds. Time always flies in these things. I thought we were about a half an hour in, and I see I've been talking for almost an hour already. What does the future hold? I'll try to go through this a little bit quickly, and then turn to the questions, of which I see there are a few in the Q&A. So, questions going forward, just things that occur to me as questions with respect to sort of the great gun buying spree of 2020 and gun culture 2.0. One is whether, all of these new gun owners, these nearly 4 million people who became new gun owners in 2020, will they persist as gun owners, right? And I've heard from people who work in gun stores that they are starting to see some people who bought guns in 2020, 2021, starting to want to return their guns and sell them back to the gun stores, unused firearms that they bought during the pandemic. And so, some of these new gun owners may end up like the people who bought Pelotons or kettlebells or recreational vehicles during 2020 and realize that it's not part of their lifestyle going forward. Will they adopt a gun owner identity that connects them robustly to the broader gun culture, right? So there is a difference between a person who owns a gun and someone who sees themselves as a gun owner, right? Only someone who really sees themselves as a gun owner will connect to gun owner types of activities, being involved in communities, either online or in the real world, and particularly being involved in any kind of gun politics. So, somehow if people, there's a lot of celebration of all of the new gun owners coming in by people who are 2A advocates, but, someone who buys a gun in response to the pandemic is not the same as someone who's a 2A advocate. Those people have to first see themselves as gun owners. Will they transition into other gun culture activities like hunting, target shooting, competition, and collecting? Again, a lot of people, if you ask why do you own guns, they say all of the above. So, whether these new gun owners ever become part of the broader non-gun culture 2.0 gun culture, that's an open question, right? And of course, will they become advocates for the Second Amendment? I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's an important question as we think about these folks. There's also been some argument that, there are already 3 gun cultures in America, that there's a gun culture 3.0. This is a study that I believe I've included in the syllabus. But but they, show the pattern of development over time from, recreational gun culture declining, self-defense inclining. So those would be gun cultures 1.0 and gun culture 2.0. But they also argue that that third blue line, Second Amendment, is a gun culture 3.0. And I argue against that for reasons I won't get into here. But it does suggest that there are people who are involved in gun culture, not primarily for recreation or for self-defense, but for the Second Amendment and for the political aspect of gun ownership. And many of these people aren't even gun owners, right? You can support the Second Amendment as part of your political ideology and activity without even being a gun owner. So, this is something that I'm monitoring over time. But as I said, there can't be a gun culture 3.0 until I'm done with my work on gun culture 2.0. All right, and the last thing I'll say, and this is the conclusion to my Gun Culture 2.0 article, possible futures, right? I call this going where angels fear to tread because, my dissertation advisor always tried to convince me that sociologists go where angels fear to tread. I'm very reluctant to make predictions about the future because I can't even claim to have a full grasp on the present, but people want to know where I think things are going. So here are some possible futures, right? Gun culture 2.0 can continue to grow and consolidate, especially in the post-Bruin era, which promises to further normalize defensive gun culture. And we've seen sort of the continuing growth of permitless carry. We'll talk about that more next week. Gun culture 2.0 could fragment, right? You could get politically liberal defensive gun owners or racial minority defensive gun owners sort of squaring off against white paramilitary vigilante militia gun owners, right? So the idea that, everybody who owns guns for defensive purposes today are part of some big tent, one big happy family is not necessarily the case, right? The fact that many people own guns for self-defense is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't take us all the way to where we want to go, which is to understand the full diversity of gun ownership. Okay, we could see a fragmentation of gun culture overall so that the center doesn't hold, right? There is no single center of gravity going forward due to differentiation of interests and specialization, so that you just have a lot of subcultures, but no core of American gun culture, right? That could go along with actually the fragmentation of gun culture 2.0. And finally, there could be an emergence of a new center of gravity in gun culture, a true gun culture 3.0. This could be around a political sacralization of the Second Amendment. And again, there is a strong impulse toward this. Whether it ever becomes a true core of gun culture remains an open question. But, again, that is something that I keep my eyes open for. Okay, so again, as with last week, I've taken a full hour to present my prepared material. Honestly, unlike in my face-to-face class where I have to be very attuned to, how much I can present in any given session, I truly thought I prepared about 30 minutes worth of material today. So I guess I'm a bit over-prepared. But if your available time is from 6 to 7, then I understand you may sign off at this point. The recording should continue. And so if you want to pick up the Q&A when you get the notice for the recording being available, you can do that. Otherwise, I'm going to go through and try to answer some of the questions that I see have come in here. John Paris asked me to plug the book club session that starts on Thursday. Those of you who follow me on social media, or if you get my newsletter, know that we're starting a 3-session book club on a book by Jonathan Metzl called What We've Become. living and dying in a country of arms. He's very critical of guns and gun culture. I'm looking forward to reading him because he's a very prominent voice in this space. He gets a lot of attention among scholars and among the broader media. And so I think it's important to understand what he has to say, see what we agree with, so see what we disagree with. So those are going to be running on 3 Thursdays. Again, it's 6 p.m. Eastern time. These sessions are not recorded. I think for purposes of candor, it's better to have these discussions sort of without the prying eye of a camera. But if you want to sign up for that, you can find a registration link around on my social media or on my newsletter. So thank you for asking that question. Sean Sorrentino, your early slide on innocuous uses separated self-defense. Should we take that to mean that the person did not see that as innocuous? Yeah, I mean, I think that, James Wright really kind of thought of, when he's writing this 10 essential observations on guns piece, rhetorically, he's not writing it for gun owners. He's writing it for critics of guns, right? Especially for scholars who study guns, right? So, he's sort of saying, hey, we can all agree that owning guns for sport and recreation is innocuous. He even calls guns the most widely owned piece of sporting goods in the country. So provocative hot take there. I don't think that he would think that gun ownership for purposes of self-defense are as innocuous. I think he recognizes that would be somewhat more problematic for a lot of people. I don't know that he thinks that it's problematic in his himself, the way that he sets up the piece. We'll look more into that in the coming weeks, that observation 4. But I definitely think that he thinks everybody should agree that sporting purposes are innocuous. And obviously that may be not something that he should say. Firearms first created in 10th century, blah, 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 200,000 years. So Anthony's asking about 200,000 years. So the 300,000 years refers not to firearms, but to projectile weapons, more broadly. So, anything that is a weapon that involves a projectile. And again, for me, if you pick up a rock and you throw a rock at something, then that's a projectile weapon. But of course, these become more complex, when you talk about sharpening those rocks and attaching them to sticks, and then you figure out a way to use a bow to, launch those. And then obviously with the gunpowder revolution, things change. But, so again, going far back, in history to 200,000 years as projectile weapons, and then guns are just a part of that. So this is Randy Meon's argument about the human-weapon relationship. This is John Nystrom, many of those in this webinar audience are gun culture 1.0 or 1.0 transitioned in or toward 2.0, fully invested in both cultures. Fact leads to the possibility of gun culture 2.0 participants who have no involvement in 1.0. What are the connections between the two cultures, and what are the differences? Certainly, again, this distinction between 1.0 and 2.0 is heuristic. I know a lot of people who characterize themselves as gun culture 1.5, that they came up in gun culture 1.0 and they made the transition over, but they, keep one foot in each of the cultures. But I do think that there are some people who are, truly just gun culture 1.0. They're strictly interested in hunting, recreational shooting, and collecting, and want nothing to do with gun culture 2.0. And, in some ways find gun culture 2.0 distasteful. Sort of derogatorily, these would be considered by many FUDs, right? That a proper gun has a wooden stock, not plastic, and so on. And I meet these people quite often, they're outdoors men, some outdoors women, and, they really, are very much focused just on gun culture 1.0. And I think it is the case that many, especially new gun owners who come into gun culture for defensive purposes, are very disconnected from people who are involved more in the hunting and collecting side. Now, sport shooting, I think, is an interesting intersection between the two, because we know, with the rise of the civilian gun training industry and Jeff Cooper, the founding of the International Practical Shooting Confederation, the IDPA, International Defensive Pistol Association, these things were trying to create a bridge between sport shooting and defensive shooting. I mean, you could even, I guess, go back to, Cooper's leather slap competitions that preceded his founding of Gunsight. But the arena of sport shooting might be a place where gun culture 1.0 and gun culture 2.0 might best meet. David goes, I wonder if handgun prevalence has something to do with diminished opportunities to shoot rifles. When I grew up in the 70s, you could go out in the woods with a 22 rifle and plink away. Those opportunities are greatly reduced now. Yeah, certainly I think you have to think about that, particularly when we see this overlap between suburban and urban gun owners being much more likely to own handguns. Even where I live, which is, in the Moxville, the redneck capital of North Carolina, the range that I belong to is a 25-yard handgun only range. So you do have to have a lot more space to own rifles. And if, that were the only data point that we have, I think we might say, well, it's just because people don't have opportunities to shoot rifles. But I think when we look at all of the other data around gun culture 2.0 and why people are buying firearms for home defense and for public gun carry, that it's not just that. But certainly, we shouldn't rule out the limited opportunities to shoot rifles. Scott DeBruin says, is advertising driving the trend, or is the trend driving the advertising? I mean, this is a great question, the kind of chicken or the egg question. I just sidestep that and say, that advertising, is a sort of mirror and a mold, right? So it mirrors people's interests and it molds people's interests. Whether it's, best understood as driving or being driven by, it's not a question I answer, and this is where my lack of specialization in the study of advertising becomes a liability. So for me, it's just a convenient way to measure changes that are happening in the culture. But certainly, it's very likely to be an iterative process, right? That people get interested in guns for defense, companies make guns for defense, they advertise those guns, and more people become interested in defensive firearms because of that, and so on and so on. This is one of the reasons why gun culture 2.0 sort of builds, right? It seeds itself, it buds, and then it blooms. And then, once defensive gun ownership becomes more normal in all the different ways that it is more normal today than it was 40 years ago, that just makes it easier for one of those people who sense, hey, I have concerns about my safety and security. What can I do about it? Some people will get a dog, some people will install a security system, some people buy a house in a gated community, and some people will get a firearm, right? And so defensive firearms are much more available as an idea for people today. So certainly I think advertising doesn't just reflect interest, but it does have the capacity to mold interest. Am I familiar with Tiffany Johnson and Akil Kadir's work with their presentation, Broadening the 2A Tent and their Gateway Instructor Certification course, Tim Reedy? I am, yes, but I'm happy to give Tiffany and Akil a nod here. During the COVID year, when I was teaching my Sociology of Guns class online, they both zoomed into my course to talk about defensive gun ownership and African-American gun ownership. And they are two, smart and sensitive people working in the gun training space, and they're broadening the 2A tent. It used to be available for free as a kind of free webinar on their website. So I would suggest everybody to Google Tiffany Johnson and Akil Kadir broadening the 2A tent, and you should be able to find that free webinar. Where can one view the previous sessions if this is their first session? So what I'm going to do is once the cloud recording for this session is available, I have to put that into an auto email that gets generated from within Zoom. And that usually goes out one day after the close of the webinar. So what I'm going to try to do is to include the links for every webinar as we add to them week after week. So if you missed the first webinar, you weren't registered when the first webinar happened, sometime tomorrow evening, you should get an email from Zoom giving a link to today's webinar and also a link to the previous webinar. These links are good for 180 days. So hopefully within 6 months, you have an opportunity to view them if you want to view them. And if anytime something goes wrong, if you don't get the link, check your spam, of course, but also be in touch with me. I don't get those emails for some reason. I guess I should register for the course under a different email, but I only know that people get their emails if they tell me they get their emails. And then again, I will post an excerpt from today on my YouTube channel on Wednesday. If you want to continue the discussion of these things, please feel free to do that in the comments over there. Ryan Jones, what is the basis for the claim that the academic discussion is dominated by hegemonic masculinity? Aren't women statistically overrepresented in colleges and furthermore overrepresented in the liberal arts such as sociology and criminology? Absolutely overrepresented. But just because you're a woman doesn't mean you don't use the concept of hegemonic masculinity to explain gun ownership. So whether you're male, female, or other, identifying if you're a part of the mainstream of gun scholars, hegemonic masculinity is the central way of understanding one of the primary drivers of gun ownership, right? And if you add, heteronormativity to that, if you add white racism to that, then you're starting to understand what I call the master narrative of studying guns. This is something it's a part of my bigger project, but that's the short answer, Ryan, to your question, is that regardless of your gender identity, you apply the concept of hegemonic masculinity if you want to understand not just why men own guns, but also in interesting ways why women own guns. Hello, Nori. Hello. Are there studies that explore rates of gun ownership and attitudes for religious minorities? Yeah, there have been studies at the intersection of gun ownership and religion. Actually, my first publication ever was on religion and gun ownership. And the field has progressed a little bit since then, but not a ton. I'll try to dig up some links and maybe drop them in the class at the start of next week. But there are those studies, Hillel. With all the talk in the presentation about the increase in gun purchases during the pandemic era, are you inferring that the pandemic caused the increase in gun sales? I think that there are many other things taking place in the country that drove these purchases. Yeah, absolutely. I use pandemic gun buying spree as kind of shorthand, but I think as that table on gun buying spikes makes clear, you begin the year with spikes clearly related to the COVID pandemic, because we can see the pandemic was declared on a Friday, and the following Monday was one of the biggest days for NICS checks in American history, if not the biggest day. But then, as you will well recall, later that year, you have George Floyd being killed by Minneapolis police officers and the protests that arose around that. That certainly drove gun buying. You had all of the uncertainty around the insane presidential race in 2020. That certainly kept interest in gun buying up. And then again, this we call the long 2020 or 2020 plus. This continued on into 2021 with a huge spike in gun buying around the um, insurrection at the Capitol or the whatever tourist visit that people did. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. I saw people smashing windows and organizing, and there are people going to jail for it. So I'll say I use the term insurrection kind of without apology. And then, of course, anytime a Democrat is elected, especially one with as strong a gun control resume as Joe Biden has, this is going to drive gun buying also. So, to your question, Mark, that's fair. I use the pandemic as kind of shorthand, but there's a lot of reasons why people bought guns in 2020 plus. Most of them, I think, out of concern for safety and security, but how people conceptualize safety and security, could differ. And, this kind of goes back to that idea of a fragmentation of gun culture 2.0. Is there any data? This is Lonnie Weissman. Hey, Lonnie, is there any data on how often new gun owners actually train with their guns? Also, what type of training they participate in? I think that, there's not been a strong interest in collecting data on levels of training. There's been some, and it's very limited. I don't know whether those people who fielded the 2021 National Firearms Survey from Harvard and Northeastern asked questions about training, but they're the ones who've got the best data on these new gun owners. So I may check in with them and see what they've got on training, because, it's a tremendous question. I know I've seen people like at the local level in guns, like if you have a gun store and a range, you do training. I know a lot of those gun sellers were not so happy. They were happy that they were selling a lot of guns. They were not so happy that they couldn't motivate a lot of those gun owners even to take a basic safety class. So, I think we can infer that a lot of those new gun owners are not participating in any kind of serious gun training, as most old gun owners don't participate in much serious firearms training. Randy Wallen, training after purchase for new gun owners, how much follow through? Yeah, again, I don't know the answer to that question. Probably not as many as we would hope. And, if you simply bought a gun for home defense, you're not even getting any kind of concealed carry or license to carry course. What is proposed as gun culture 3.0? I think that see the concluding slides. I think that a lot of people, some people, I guess I can answer it a little bit further. Some people consider tactical gun culture as being a gun culture 3.0, that it's sort of beyond the defensive gun culture. So, these are people who have tactical rifles with red dots and plate carriers, night vision, like all of that sort of thing. Some people think of that as being an evolution of gun culture, a kind of political evolution of gun culture. I honestly don't think there is a gun culture 3.0 right now, so it's a little bit hard for me to answer that question, John. Others probably have better answers if they think that they're participating in gun culture 3.0. I'd like to hear more about it. Please speak to the issues of various minority groups, not just racial minorities, but other sociologically divided minorities, and their tendencies to suppress disclosure of gun ownership, interest in usage, versus stereotyping that might tend to minimize or inaccurately rate their participation in gun culture. I don't know the full meaning behind the question, but I can, definitely say that I know, many people who are politically liberal, many people who are racial minorities, many people who are gender and sexual minorities who don't disclose the fact that they're gun owners. They're sort of closeted, so to speak, because for, various reasons. I can't speak for them, but I know that for some of them, they don't think that they benefit at all from, having people know that they're gun owners. They might, feel like that might make them more subject to certain types of victimization. And I know that some people kind of recoil from, again, what the some of the most visible face of gun owners are, right? And, I think I mentioned last week when I'm watching the events unfold on January 6th, right? I know that there are going to be some gun owner organizations front and center, at that event, and that many people that will be the face of gun owners. And so do I want to say, yes, I'm a gun owner? And, people might think, oh, well, you're that kind of person. Maybe not, right? For me, it took me quite a while actually to really kind of come out and embrace my gun ownership standing. But when I did, it was very interesting to see the number of people, like, for example, Wake Forest faculty who approached me and quietly would say in whispers, uh, yeah, I'm a gun owner too. If you're a Wake Forest faculty member and a gun owner, what do you gain from being open about that? Now, the other side of that is if many people who represent a different face of gun owners, remain closeted about that, then that distorts people's understanding of what gun owners look like. So, I advocate for people to be as open as they feel comfortable being about their gun ownership status, though I totally understand why people would want to hide that. Edward, has a study been conducted that asks if purchases are increasing for people who are in a marginalized group? Yeah, I think that some of the data that I provided shows that there's an increasing portion of marginalized groups who are buying guns. There are some groups, marginalized groups, that are so small that they don't show up in a lot of data, right? So if you want to understand people who are gender non-binary gun owners, that's such a small portion of the American population that, if you do a survey of a random sample of the population, you're not going to pick up many. So you have to do that more intentionally. John Sponauer, I'm often discussing guns online, and very often I'll see people citing Western movies, etc., as creating a normative culture of lawmen, good men versus bad, etc., and maybe a precursor to gun culture 2.0. Thoughts on the role of popular culture in gun culture 2.0? Yeah, many of these things have deep roots, and I'm currently in the process of reading, I don't think I have it here, um, a book about really the history of gun culture, the history of the NRA, and the ideas that underpin it. And one of the things that the author argues is that what gun culture embodies is a form of martial republicanism. And so this idea, that armed citizens, fight for the country is something that is deep, deep, deep in American culture. So it's not surprising, that we would see, some of those themes drawn in then to popular culture. But yeah, popular culture, is really saturated with a lot of these things. But I don't know that there's a direct translation from the Western, in which it's lawmen, carry guns for good, not the average citizen carries guns for good, which is more the, I think, gun culture 2.0 idea. It's a great question, though. It goes beyond what I know. Kevin Michalowski, executive editor of Concealed Carry Magazine. Wow, I'm flattered that you're here and that you've asked this question. I've seen the post-Bruen era as the start of more and more attacks on gun ownership. In covering these stories, Bruen has not put an end to litigation, but seems to inspired more efforts. Do you see the strength of the Bruen decision having a positive or negative effect on anti-gun efforts? Yeah, I think that Kevin's exactly right that the Bruin decision settles certain issues. But as we've seen over the entire course of American history, gun rights and gun regulations have been in tension with one another. So if you get a movement toward more gun rights, you get a reactionary movement towards more regulation. If you get a reactionary movement toward regulation, you get a reaction pushing for more rights. So there is a dynamic tension between these two aspects of our American reality. And in those places that are dominated, by Democrats, you're going to see every effort made to resist the implications of Bruin within the boundaries that are set for this by the Supreme Court, much of which is to be determined. And in those red areas, you're going to try to see people maximizing allowable gun rights. Bruin, they're already the red area is already ahead of Bruin in that sense, right? So Bruin really only affects in significant ways the blue areas. But yeah, I think that when we look at the really the war over guns that's being fought in the United States between gun rights and gun regulation, you have to see these things is in a dynamic tension with one another. So it's back and forth, trying to find, where uh, people want America to be. And as we become more and more polarized into red and blue, that's just going to be reflected in the way that legislators respond to the Bruin decision. How would I advise Gun Culture 1.0 Gun Club to embrace Gun Culture 2.0 ideas and growth? Um, I think that I don't have a plan for this, but the way I think that a lot of it would be the same ways I would engage people who are gun skeptics, which is, to try to have open conversations with people, try to understand where people are coming from, to express empathy for people, to, realize that gun culture 1.0 reason people have their beliefs for a reason and so on. So, if you're gun full on into gun culture, um, 2.0 and you run into some gun culture 1.0 people, just don't be an asshole. I think that would be a start. Post the URL to my blog, gunculture2.0.com. If you Google gun culture 2.0, you'll find it. So I don't do enough branded advertising, I guess.
I put it in the chat too.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Apparently it's in the chat. Anyway, like I in part don't remember to post links to a lot of things because searches are so good now. So if you search Gun Culture 2.0, you should pull it up. If you want to know about my book and you search Gun Curious, you can find it. If you search Light Over Heat, you should find my YouTube channel and so on. But if you ever have trouble, apparently the chat is doing well to answer some of these questions. Okay, Christopher Fernandez. So, David, have you seen the trends in gun ownership since the pandemic creep over into your world? Have any of your peers admitted to moving into the gun owner demographic, or have any adjusted their understanding of gun culture or gun owners in a more accepting direction? I'd say, to the first question, I think, there are a lot of new non-traditional gun owners who came into the fold during the long 2020. And certainly, I see some of those people around me. Again, I mentioned, just briefly the Wake Forest professors who like in, whispered tones tell me that they own guns. I've also had Wake Forest professors and other friends, ask me to take them to the range or to advise them on what kind of gun they should buy and so on. So, I certainly, I think that the changing face of gun owners is a real thing, and all of us, may know someone who would fit into that. In terms of adjusting their understanding of gun culture or gun owners, I think that this is still to be determined. That the gun issue is still so fraught. The National Democratic Party is completely bought into a certain gun control agenda. the National Republican Party is bought into completely a particular gun rights agenda. And so, I think that there are a lot of people who still see the issue of guns in black and white, right? And you can continue to see the issue of guns in black and white even if you become a gun owner, right? There are many people who are gun owners who also favor every point in the Brady campaign's agenda, right? Uh, Universal background checks, assault weapons ban, red flag laws, safe storage laws, right? That we, shouldn't pretend that no gun owners, favor these particular kinds of laws. In the same way that, you have people who are non-gun owners who oppose all of those laws, right? So it's, very, very complex. All right, I'm going to answer just two more questions and then get going. I appreciate all of you who are hanging in there. I'm getting to be maybe at the limit of what I have to say that's interesting and coherent. But Marcus Melnick, why is there such a dichotomy in firearms-related decisions throughout the judicial system? Well, I think the real answer is that these positions in the judiciary, which are supposed to be nonpartisan, are also, depending on the level of you're looking at, are they're either elected positions or they're political appointees, right? So one of the reasons why the Supreme Court has less legitimacy than it's had in the past is that people just see it as being, our red-blue politics just put into the judicial system. And I'm not a court watcher myself, but I'm sure that there are districts in the United States which are seen to be much more conservative, and there are districts that are seen to be more liberal. And so, I think that's where that dichotomy is coming from. And last, John Doty, fellow Tar Heel. Anecdotally, since Pulse and the founding of Operation Blazing Sword, there's definitely been both significantly increased interest in defensive gun ownership and some backlash from our own community who think that gun control keeps us safer than gun ownership. And not a question, but I think, a fair point. And again, this is, understanding that there is a portion of the LGBTQ community who are very much pro gun ownership for self-defense, and there's a larger proportion of those people or that community who see guns as being the problem and gun regulations as being the solution. So, we certainly, at the same time, we see growing diversity among gun owners in terms of demographic backgrounds. We also, should recognize that there's division, in those groups, right? So you've got National African American Gun Association, representing Black gun owners. You also have, major civil rights organizations who come out for more gun regulation. And again, you can be a member of NAGA or of Operation Blazing Sword and favor more gun regulation, right? So these two things are not opposed to one another. The complex reality, the paradox of guns, as I said last week, is a true reality. Hopefully we'll, continue to dig into that next week. We'll take up the concealed carry revolution as a specific part of the movement toward gun culture 2.0. And then we'll sort of move into some more looking at maybe the downsides and negative outcomes associated with firearms as we go forward. So thank you all. Again, I see quite a few people still hanging in there. I appreciate it. If you left and you're just coming back to the recording now, nice to see you. Thanks for checking out the recording. And watch for the excerpt coming on my YouTube channel Wednesday if you want to continue the discussion there. Thank you so much, everybody. I get a lot of energy from your engagement, and I hope I'm bringing some value also to this issue. And I will see you all next week.